Hello, my name is Parsa Ansari, and I've created this presentation along with Asbed Demerdjian and Villafana to address the issue of First Nations and Indigenous inequalities in Canada and propose policies that we can implement to reduce these inequalities and to ultimately improve the quality of life for Indigenous people across Canada. In order to discuss the inequalities that Indigenous populations face in Canada, we should understand the context, and that is that they've endured a history of trauma across Canada, much like the United States. Residential school systems separated Indigenous children from their families, forcing them to assimilate to Canadian culture, eradicating their native culture and languages and identities. With the last residential school closing in 1996, we can very much expect that the lasting effects of colonization are still felt today, and Indigenous populations are very much still in a state of repair. There are over 1.6 million Indigenous people in Canada, and a significant amount of them are experiencing poverty conditions stemming from food insecurity, lack of employment opportunity, and lack of healthcare resources, costing the Canadian government over $12 billion annually to address the lack of economic prosperity in Indigenous communities. Limited services on their reserves create economic leakage, wherein they're spending their money off of the reserve in urban communities where they are not retaining the revenue and they are not retaining money to spend on their own services and on their own communities. To receive any government benefits at all, they need Indian status, and the registration process for that is often confusing and inconsistent in application for Indigenous people who are not educated on the issue. All of those issues together bring us to three major points of contention, and that is the lacking resources for Indigenous communities, the issues surrounding the Indian Act, which defines rights for Indigenous people, and ultimately the barrier to trust from Indigenous communities with the government. The government seems to be lacking in their approach to addressing Indigenous problems, and their history of trauma certainly does not benefit the trust with the communities that they are trying to help. In order to implement a policy that addresses Indigenous inequality in Canada, we need to understand what resources the Indigenous communities are lacking in the first place. Now, 54% of Indigenous people on reserves experience food insecurity. But what's more troubling is that even off reserve, their probability of food insecurity is 50% higher than that of the general population. What this means is that there are compounding poverty circumstances that seem to significantly impact Indigenous people more than the general population, and that should definitely be addressed when implementing policy to help them. Only 23% of the Inuit population have access to a regular doctor, and healthcare shortage is a common issue that we see in the Indigenous communities across Canada, especially in rural communities where the cost of travel to major medical centers in urban areas sometimes outweighs costs of medical procedures themselves. So transportation to and from medical institutions should definitely be addressed. Indigenous communities across Canada have a serious issue of economic leakage, stemming from a lack of economic opportunity and services in their own communities. Approximately 90% of First Nations spending ends up going off reserve to services that are not available within their own communities. Now, with First Nations community spending over $741 million to Saskatchewan alone, they do not contribute an insignificant amount of money to the economy. And Indigenous unemployment is around double the general population. So this issue is definitely stemming from a lack of economic and employment opportunity within their own communities. And the Canadian government definitely has a responsibility to address this by providing stimulus to Indigenous economies. Here we can see that the median income for Native populations is lower than the average population across the board, so economic development for Native communities needs to be prioritized. Here's some more evidence that Indigenous populations face low-income situations at a far greater rate than the average population. That brings us to the first step of our policy proposal to help the Indigenous population, and that is to simplify issues with the Indian Act that was originally designed to force the assimilation of Indigenous people and evolved to define their rights, but only issues benefits to status Indians and those who are registered. With a registration rate of less than 50%, the government needs to do better at rolling out the services for Indigenous people and increasing the benefits for non-status groups. Here we can see a plot showing that there are many non-status groups in Canada that do not receive the same benefits as defined in the Indian Act, and with a long and complicated registration process, even status Indians have a difficult time attaining these benefits. This brings us to another element of increasing prosperity for Indigenous populations, and that is rebuilding the trust with these communities so that they're more likely to seek benefits from the government. The Auditor General of Canada has shown that resource assessments are very sparing, which leads to shortage of much needed resources for Indigenous hospitals and education services. It will be generations before the trust can be restored, but if the government shows that they're proactive and not just waiting for court demands that they do something, the Indigenous population will be more likely to trust them and receive the benefits that they need. Our policy proposal focuses on simple yet effective measures for increasing Indigenous prosperity. Part of this includes fast-tracking Indigenous healthcare training to provide culturally sensitive care, as suggested by the Assembly of First Nations. Another is to eliminate the unrealistic promises by the government for Indigenous services that will never actually be followed up on. That won't cost any money, it just requires honesty and transparency. Another thing that won't be as costly for the government is eliminating the arbitrary exclusions for government benefits as defined in the Indian Act. Now, the Indian Act is seen as inadequate because it does not address issues for non-status Indians, and even for status people, they have difficulties accessing the resources because the applications process is lengthy and overcomplicated. Another issue is funding transport for remote communities in need of healthcare. This project already exists, but it is seldom activated because of poor enrollment rates. Another is to treat Indigenous projects like any other government project instead of treating Indigenous communities like second-class citizens. Again, this just requires honesty and transparency and not establishing separate departments to work on these projects, but instead handing them over to the more effective and larger government departments that are able to tackle severe infrastructure issues like water quality. Canada has some serious ethical obligations to make up for the traumatic history of the Indigenous population and to improve their basic image to the Indigenous communities. Now, that includes fulfilling current obligations to provide basic services and rights like quality of water and child benefits as promised by Justin Trudeau many times. They should also allow for organic economic growth while minimizing government infringement of Indigenous businesses. Now, marketing for existing programs to increase enrollment is very important. As previously mentioned, enrollment for government services is very low because the Indian Act requires lengthy and overcomplicated applications. To accomplish these tasks, it is important that the Canadian government understand a blanket approach will not work to address issues facing very diverse Indigenous groups. As we've seen with the Indian Act, government solutions may not apply to all Indigenous groups, especially non-status Indians. Community leaders themselves are much better suited to understanding their specific needs, so the government should let the Assembly of First Nations and other Indigenous support groups consult with them before implementing any policies. And any policies implemented should use communities that are not receiving additional treatments as control groups to measure the success rate of the policies themselves. To be clear, our policy proposal does not entail creating new and costly government projects. Instead, it involves increasing the effectiveness of current government programs by consulting frequently with community leaders. This can be done in quarterly meetings with the Assembly of First Nations and other Indigenous rights groups. Another responsibility of the Canadian government is to pick up their auditing service. The Canadian Auditor General reported himself that resource assessments need to be conducted more often to address resource shortages as they vary across the Indigenous landscape. Now, to measure the impact of these programs, they should more frequently track the metrics for the treatment groups that are receiving government benefits. This includes consistently tracking unemployment, food insecurity, and healthcare access, as Indigenous rights groups have reported that these metrics are often underreported by current government services. So, what can be expected of a simple policy proposal to eliminate exclusions from the Indian Act and to consult more frequently in transparent meetings with community leaders? Well, we can expect that existing programs may work better because they're currently underutilized, and enrollment of social programs will increase as Indigenous leaders market them to their own communities. Many of them are currently unaware that these programs even exist. So, with that being said, Indigenous communities will start to catch up to the general population in terms of health and economic prosperity without struggling over basic resource shortages that are already addressed with government programs but are not received by Indigenous populations who are not enrolled in these programs. Indigenous Services Canada already has many effective programs in place to address Indigenous inequality. However, because it's not treated as a priority by the government like typical public goods and services, we don't see the marketing necessary to increase the enrollment rates, and instead we see high administrative costs resulting from confusing rollout because the government does not communicate with community leaders on how best to market these programs to the population. Implementing our policy suggestions will be a great step towards economic development for Indigenous communities, which will ultimately be great economic stimulus for Canada as a whole to reduce the burden of Indigenous poverty costs and to increase economic opportunities in developing communities.